meet me today on this wonderful spring day. It's freezing cold. It's been raining all morning, but it's very early on in spring. And what we're going to do is we're going to put this float legged bait out. I've been feeding a little bit of bait, and we're going to see why I'm using this method, what I'm using this method for, and whether we can catch a fish on it. So let's get it in and see if it does the job for us. Yeah, bream. Okay, we've managed to get a bite. We've had to wait a bit. I think we're getting a bit nervous. Ah, it's a carp, it's not a tench. Never mind, never mind, never mind. Good fun. Float did its job perfect. Come on. Powerful things in here. Go on, darling. Oh! And he's in the net. So we've got a result. I'll get a mat, we'll get her out and have a look at what we caught. Okay, so there he is. Little mirror, about £6. On the float legged maggot. So we'll get him back in a sec and I'll talk through exactly what rig we're using and why we're using it and why it's so good for this time of year, even on grim spring days like this. So let's get him back and go through the rig. Okay, so this year, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and go out and for each change of the season, for each different sort of species I fish for, do a different method of float fishing. Really enjoyed it over the last couple of years. Been doing a lot of different types of float fishing and it's been absolutely fantastic fun. We've got some wonderful new products from Korum out to help you fish the float for these specimen fish and for a bit of everything really. So today you join us, like I say, springtime. I know it's spring because the clocks have gone back and the frogs are out and I can hear them while I'm fishing, but to be fair, it's more like fishing midwinter. But this method suits it absolutely perfect. And what we're doing is we're float ledgering. Why aren't I just ledgering with the buzzer? Well, hopefully we can show you that today because I can watch me float. I've got my rod here by the side of me. I can see what's going on my patch. Oh, and we just had a bite. And it's a great method for these sort of early spring species that we're fishing for. So in this pool, we're again at the wonderful Merrington fishery. And we've been allowed to fish this pool. It's got some really nice tench in it and some lovely carp. So it's sort of, we're not expecting a lot of action. But instead of sitting behind buzzers and just waiting it out, we're actually engaged in what's going on a patch because we can see that through the float. We're able to feed and adjust our feed over the top to keep the interest of the fish around by our hook bait. Okay, so I'm just going to run through the pieces of kit I'm using for float ledgering and talk a little more about how I set this up. I've got a 13-foot float rod. It's one of our new Korum Omega rods. Beautiful piece of kit. And I've got an access reel. The one thing I must say with float ledger is you want sinking line. We do some wonderful floating line at Korum, and we'll be looking at that this year when we're on the river. When we're trotting a float, that's all we want, floating line. But when you're doing this, you really do want sinking line, because I'll show you in a second how we tighten down to the float, adjust the float to get it perfect, so it's perfect bite indication, but also sink that line between you and the float. If you don't, you'll get a big tow when the wind comes on. Tow the line and it'll actually cause the float to dip and give you false bites. So that's the rod, sinking line, got that sorted. I'm using a loaded waggler from Preston, and that's held with 2 float stops. I've plumbed the depth today. Now you can fish this float ledger method with the likes of self-adjusting floats like the Polaris, things like that, but I'm not doing that. I prefer to plumb the depth, and I'll explain a little more. We'll put the float in the swim in a second, and I'll explain why I go to great lengths to plumb the depth of where I'm going to fish before I fish. So that's my float, and then it comes straight down to, and it's really simple. So I've got a quick change bead, hook length, size 12 power hook, couple of maggots and my worm and maggot combo. Used it last year, absolutely fantastic everywhere I went. I've got a feeder bead, and I've got a little 3/4 of an ounce Preston lead. So basically that's it. So you could cast that out as a ledger rig. So basically it is what it says on the tin. It's a ledger rig with a float above it that just gives me far more indication than if I was putting it in a buzzer with a bobbin on. I can see exactly what's happening straight away. The other great thing it does is when your lead's on the bottom, my float comes up to the top, it tells me exactly where my lead is, so I can feed over the top of it. So it's almost like fishing to a permanent marker float. And the other thing it does is, instead of the line going across the bottom as it does to a ledger normally, like that, and cutting through where all the fish swim, so the fish are banging into the line, my line goes straight up to the float. So it gives a little bit of a different presentation where everybody else is ledgering. It just changes the angle of the line, which when you're fishing for half-wary fish, and these sort of bigger species we're after in spring, they've been fished for a bit, they're not stupid, they're not feeding a great deal at this time of year, especially in weather like this. So all the little tricks help to catch 1 or 2 more and get you another bite. Okay, so like I said, I plumbed the depth. I plumbed the depth very accurately to where I'm fishing. I'm fishing in line with a mark on the opposite bank. So I've got a little tuft of grass on the opposite bank I'm casting to with a post by it. And what I'm doing is I'm putting that out. I've got my line in the clip. When I bring it in, if I haven't had a fish, I pop my line in the clip, so I'm going out the same distance. I know it's the same depth because I've plumbed it, so I know exactly when I'm on the right spot. So I'm going to put this out now and show you the accuracy of adjustment with it. So lining up with my mark, dropping the float out. Okay, so the float comes up to the surface, just tightening up a couple of clicks on the drag, and as I'm tightening up, the float is actually going down to the depth I want it. So I want the float just with a couple of inches sitting out of the water, and literally every click of the reel will move that a centimetre or two underneath. So I've got that absolutely perfect. My float's now over the top of my bait. So my bait's on the bottom, the float's sitting there perfect. I've reeled it down, sunk the line. So the line's coming up to the float and then to my rod under the water. Perfectly concealed. I've got an accurate gauge of when I'm getting a bite, and the clutch is just wound off. So if I do get because we're fishing for reasonable sized tench, reasonable sized carp, and you might have to wait a bit, always wise to wind your clutch off just in case one snatches it and goes. But as a bite starts to develop, I can watch it now on my float, and I can actually feed accurately, like I'm going to do here, over the top of my bait, because I've got my marker there showing me where my bait is, and I'm feeding around the float. I know my hook bait's left hand side of it, just behind it. Okay, so I'm just going to run through the ground bait that I've been using. I mean, I have been using maggots today, and I've been using Sonia Baits halibut pellets. You know, I've been fairly close with the float, so I've been able to feed with a catapult some loose feed, quite accurate. But a lot of the time with this sort of method, you're fishing a little further out, quite away from you. So your best medium to get your bait out there is ground bait. One I've been playing with quite a bit lately is the Sonia Baits Deep Water. It's a real salty, sticky mix that it's got great binding qualities, and you can put a lot of bits and pieces like hemp, sweet corn, maggots, and it'll bind it a decent ball, and it gets it out to your spot, withstands the throw out to your spot or the catapult, and also gets down to where you want your bait. You don't really want this ground bait breaking up when it hits the surface. Want to take the little balls or bigger balls, whichever you're putting out, and get them right down where you're fishing with the lead on the bottom. So dead simple, just the ground bait I've been using, as always, if I'm opening a can of this, either the hemp or the corn, I just use the juice out of it because it just adds that bit of attraction. The only other thing I've been using is I've got some of the Sonia Absolute fish oil. I like a bit of this at this time of year. It just helps to pump that extra bit of attraction up through the water when you're fishing on the bottom. A lot of fish, they'll be moving around in the upper layers at the moment. It's the warmer place to be for them, and it just drags them down for you. Put some pellet in it. Put some maggots in it. Put a bit of corn in it. Shows it quite well. So there you go, in 2 minutes, a real firm ball made with that mix. And as I say, it's carrying quite a few big food items in there. I've got maggots, I've got sweet corn, and I've got pellet, and it just takes it all right down to where you want it on the bottom, right by that float ledger bait. to another little mirror. We've had a few of these now. Unfortunately, we haven't touched the decent tench. Got one nice carp. We've had to look around a bit, fish a few different spots. It's been quite hard, but we've caught a few fish. It's been a grim day. It hasn't stopped raining all day. Cold wind, but just showing that a float ledger bait this time of year. We've beat the wind today. We've beat the cold. Caught a few fish and we've had some fun. So if you're out this spring, give this a whirl. Float ledgering, really good. Great for this time of year as well. Bream, tench, carp. It's the ideal method, and I'm sure, like me, you'll find it far more interesting watching a float than just sitting behind a pair of motionless indicators. Good fishing.